Non va le popolato, eccetera.
Non vale le. Ma now you. Ma no, you.
นะครับบัตรของลาสติโซของวิเดอร์คือว่าจะสู้ได้ชิลล์แค่ผมเป็นครับ
Devo che una ogni lui.
การแบบเจ็ดสิบครับ
Non so, non è da fino perché gioca.
Non sei via.
No, no, no. Ne petaps non fai problemi.
การเกี่ยวเลยถามว่าย่างโยม
Zaina è
Allora, sai,
Zaina ha busta plan. Ho metto a comunque. Zaina è chrome sa quando può fare fuori. Sei Arab star. Che UDN e Natasha Diana. Perché cioè io non va viva perché devono essere cose chiuse.
io cambia.
Ah,
Va bene, poi.
ne quello più si è
Non bucare. Ali.
va bene perché sai una pa
due qua essenziale.
Non andate a mano. No,
Apa? Tu deal apa? No, it won't work. Yeah. Yeah, we need to use a specific laptop for the. Yes, even people to do. Yeah, we're a team studio. And Mark, we need to do.
considera fare che anche lei no. Certo, non lo ancora.
Ai.
It's the one word.
No sé, filo, de
Bon. How do we know for the people online? There are people online. Gerard? Gerard? Do we have to do anything for the people online or? I don't know. I don't know if this is actual.
Yeah.
That's what I.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you. Thanks for coming to this interdisciplinary seminar marking, every Wednesday we have a small seminar for the 15th anniversary of the university. And today we have Dr. Bruno Senterre, who is going to talk to us about the ecosystems concept and how we can better understand the ecosystems. So Bruno has been developing these concepts over the years, also notably with the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, and exchanging with all the colleagues in different places. In Australia, have a different way of seeing things. We must now have a new platform concept. And Bruno comes from Belgium, University of Bruxelles, and so he's doctor in ecology, and he's been in Seychelles now for 15 years, maybe, like that or more, working on plants. He's at the base of the rediscovery of certain plants in Seychelles, and also several plants that were new. That were unknown, sorry, that are now new for science. So he's a member of our Island Bay Diversity Conservation Center, one of the co-members. So it will be a pleasure, for us to listen to you. And my apologies also for people that may be listening to us online. We had some issues with the computers, but now that's sorted out. So Bruno, thank you for coming and listening to you.
Okay, thank you. When I thought about presenting something for these seminars, that's the topic I thought about because that's at the end of the day, that's my main center of interest. It's true, like Gerard said, I'm botanist. I work on described species, but that's not my main interest. I study species and, for instance, plants because it's what helps me understand the environment in general. So that's really the core of my interest generally. And okay, let's start. So if you really want, we talk a lot about ecosystem. The words is now used all the time, but to have a real deep understanding of what ecosystems are and more advanced questions about ecosystem, if you want to do that, it's really important to go back to the classics. The word ecosystem emerged in 1935. It was in this very famous paper by Tensberg, and it was at the time in reaction to discussions with Clemens. Tensberg was English, Clemens was American, but it's at the end of about 50 years of intense research on ecosystem. They didn't have the word yet, but there was intense research and a lot of other concepts appeared along the road over 50 years. The word ecosystem came by, and if you want to understand what ecosystems are, it's really useful to go back to those classics, see how the word emerged, what were the discussions, why it was missing. It's really useful. Now, interestingly, the word ecosystems is now almost a century old, and it's still very popular. So it's a very successful word, it's a very successful concept. The definition has not changed. A lot of words, the definition changed along the way. It's not the case for ecosystem. The definition is exactly the same. So basically, it's a system of biotic elements, abiotic elements, and the interactions between all of this. There's no change. Now, the other important aspect that define ecosystem is that it's a system, so these are dynamic systems. And if you study the dynamics of systems, all systems, even systems that are not alive, it's basically two things. You can subdivide the dynamics into two things. First is the development from young to adult, so the development and the evolution along time, with time of the system. These are the two main components of what we call the dynamics, fluctuations in things. So yeah, the development, like I was saying, relates to stages, but also alternative states. And evolution involves regime shifts, and even evolution at big, larger time scales like geological times. So all that is the definition of ecosystems. That's well known, and there's basically no problem with that. But that's the main point of this presentation is we have not asked and much less answered the first question particularly. What is now an ecosystem type? Because it's nice to have the word ecosystem defined, but what is an ecosystem type? If we want to work with operational units that we can count and compare, basically for very concrete work of conservation. So what is an ecosystem type? Somehow analogous to this concept of species, we do not have that at all. And the question is barely asked. So we don't have that. And we don't have recognize the fact that we don't have that either. So it's really a huge gap. The next question, when you know how to deal with species, for example, then you need to classify them because there's so many species, you need to classify them so that you can find your way into this huge diversity. So we need the same things with ecosystem, a classification system, and generally we call it typology, a typology of ecosystem. So how do we build a typology of ecosystem? So analogous to the tree of life for species. So that's something that has been worked on since the 50s, the 1950s, quite a long time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. It's still very actively researched now, and we don't have a definite answer, but at least it's been a while we are looking into that question. Okay, so how do we build ecosystem typology? So, the first attempt to really create a typology of ecosystem is from 1956. There was a congress that was the IFAT Congress. And that was the first time that English, Australian, American, European, they were put together at the table and decided, no, we need to put a unified typology, and different countries were using different terms. The word bush, for example, means totally different things for Australian and for American and so on. So at that Congress, they sit together and try to develop the first typology of ecosystem. In the 50s and 70s, mostly parallel to that. So independently, there were mostly Czech ecologists working in Canada, in British Columbia, developed a system called the biogeothematic ecosystem classification, and which is very different because here it's a modular approach. I'll explain a little bit. And then in 1973, Americans led a major step. It was the first comprehensive global typology of terrestrial ecosystem, and it was built on the IFAT typology. That was really a big deal, and until this day, many people refer to the UNESCO typology. So very active study of how to make a typology of ecosystem until the 70s. But everything after that, so now it's been 50 years, there's no, it's conceptually stagnant. We are still stuck in the same knowledge developed at that time. Until now, we see a lot of work presenting variations of the UNESCO typology, and it never is really something really different. At this point, there are three main typologies that are dominant globally. This one, developed by the Americans, was first called International Vegetation Classification, developed by TAC, the Nature Conservancy, and the government of the USA. Now it's continued by Nature Serves, so in the USA, and it's the continuation of the UNESCO typology. There's between 10 and 30 papers of this research has been going on since the 90s, and only one of those papers come with a different approach to combine biotic and abiotic. So one paper says it has to be in parallel. So as you define from broad to specific categories of ecosystem using abiotic characters, in parallel you put in some biotic aspect. Only one paper said that. All the others do it sequentially. First, everything abiotic or bioecological, I explained, and then only after biotic communities and species. The other very important typology since the 2013, and it's also American, but it's a different organization, the United States Geological Survey. And they basically follow the idea of the BEC, the Biogeoclimatic Ecosystem Classification. It's the same thing, but they are building on that concept. And then the last one, which is going to stay for a while, it's published in 2022, and it's what we now call the Global Ecosystem Typology. So it's made by Australian people with a very broad consultation, and it's supported by the IUCN. It's the one and only standard to follow to do red listing of ecosystem. And only the last two here cover all aspects of the biosphere, terrestrial, marine, freshwater. But there's more than one that covers everything. So from that side, really the point is that since the 70s, to my opinion, it's conceptually stagnant. None of those things is completely different from what we had before. To give you a bit more view of what I just said, for all the typologies derived from the UNESCO, we generally have, for example, the physiognomy as the root, so we distinguish forest from grasslands, and then the climate, other very broad factors. And only later you have local gradients, like the type of rock, but gradients that are more local or not global gradients. And floristic aspects are really coming only at the end, and it's just
Comme si par exemple, sa website.
Can you stop the mic with online? Because we hear people talking online.
Yeah, no, comme si quand tu écris URL.
Okay.
Écris unic.ac.sc. Après mettre
Is it possible to
après Teams. Yeah, à cause ça,
je me vais demander si les gens n'arrivaient pas à suivre, ils m'appelaient qu'ils n'arrivaient pas à suivre. Donc, je lui dis.
Is it possible to cut the mic for people online? Okay. Maybe it's done. Thank you.
Please cut your microphones. We had some issues, sorry about that. So you missed the start of the presentation. Sorry.
So one important thing with systems like the typology of UNESCO, but the more recent versions of it, the Seafarber Langendu is until the 2020, so it's still very active. The main problem is that the physiognomy can tell things about ecosystem types, but also not. The physiognomy of, if you cut a forest, you don't have the physiognomy of a forest, but the ecosystem is still the same, basically, because if you cut a forest, it will be develop a forest over time. You have the redevelopment series. So all this is mixed here, very explicitly so, because there's even a level that deals explicitly with the disturbance. So it's not really a typology of ecosystem, it's a typology of vegetation, but it's used as a typology of ecosystem. So that's one problem we have with those typologies. Now, the other main type of typology that is more modular, it's done by the USGS. Now you define factors separately, like the landform, the lithology, bioclimates, thermotypes, ombrotypes, and then let cover. And then using geographic information system, you overlap all these layers, and then you get unique combinations of everything. So in that exercise, they got over 3,000 combinations of those factors, and they call that ecological land units. They use that to build the typology of ecosystem. And now the IUCN typology is bringing something a bit new compared to the others. It's based on the concept of functional generalization. And you see now, we don't start anymore with the physiognomy or any broad gradient in isolation. It's the biosphere, and we have the big realms, so there's terrestrial, marine, freshwater, subterranean, atmospheric, right? And then +6 is because they have transitional realms. So coastal, for example, is transition between terrestrial and marine. So they have then 24 biomes and about 100 functional groups. So this subdivides the biosphere from the whole into 100 functional groups. And then to have a complete typology, you take your local types of ecosystem and you nest them into the top-down typology. But it still is an addition because the bottom parts are derived based on flouristics. So it's done sequentially. Now that gives you an idea of those 24 functional biomes of the IUCN typology. They are all here. And the first letters tells you what kind of so T for terrestrial, TF for transition between terrestrial and freshwater, and so on. Now, if you take T1, the subtropical and subtropical forest biome, it contains 4 subclasses. And I'll explain a little bit on those first two. T2 is for temperate and boreal forest and woodlands. And this one contains 6 classes. So if you explore those classes at the level 2 and 3 of the typology, you see that it contains basically broad latitudinal classes, tropical, subtropical, and temperate, boreal, all grouped together. So it's broad latitudinal classes. It contains broad physiognomic classes, forest and woodlands together, so it's very broad. Altitudinal belts, you see alpine, mountain, they are spread between level 2 and level 3. You get broad wetness gradients, broad wetness classes, rainforest versus dry forest. That's very broad. You can have more details about those wetness classes. But for the temperate and boreal forest, you see that it's not so broad. It's a little bit more refined because they have the class humid forest. There's some finer nuance compared to for the class T1, where it's just rainforest versus dry forest. So in some cases, we have a refined wetness class. And at the level 3, that's where they store most of the classes that are refined latitudinal classes. So now the temperate and boreal are subdivided between boreal, temperate, cool temperate, warm temperate, and so on. And that's it. So basically the level 2 and 3, that's the gradient that are covered there. And the questions I have is what about mountain dry forest? So I've been working in West Africa where we do have mountain forest in dry parts of Africa. So there are mountain dry forests. They are quite different from mountain rainforests. So where do we classify them? Because if I look at mountain vegetation, I only have the T13 for tropical, subtropical, mountain rainforest. But I can only put rainforest there, so I cannot put my dry mountain forest. And the class 1, 2 is for dry forest, but then why did we not distinguish lowland for mountain for those ones? So it's treated differently, but there's no justification. You got the same with mountain swamp forest. Actually, the IUCN typology is looking at the main functional filters, and they say in the paper filters in plural. But in the practice, they are looking at the one and only main filter. So if you're a wetland, you go in the class wetland. If you're a mountain, it has to be the mountain. But the fact is, sometimes you have several filters that are equally important. A mountain swamp is driven as much by the fact that it's mountain than by the fact that it's a swamp. So you can't say which one is predominant than the other. And there are a number of other problems like that. For example, polar, tundra, and deserts, which is classified in the book T6, but is it really T6 or T5? Because if it's a desert, you have deserts in T5. So actually, maybe it's just a matter of better wording the classes, because as they are not mutually exclusive. If you wanted to make T5 and T6 mutually exclusive, you should have to say polar and alpine, non-desert, or something like that. As they are not mutually exclusive. Mountain savanna, same thing. They are different, but we cannot classify them in any particular place. There's another problem that is quite symptomatic: Anchialine pool. The Anchialine pool, like the cenote or you have some in Albador, they are classified as SM1, so subterranean tidal. I agree that the underground connection between the ocean and the Anchialine pool is subterranean, but the Anchialine pool is certainly not, because it's in full sun. You have plants growing there, so the Anchialine pool is not a transitional real subterranean. It's not subterranean. To me, these are the problems in the IUCN typology, and they come from, well, first, an admitted gap in the paper is that the bottom-up part, you see the IUCN typology is the top-down, level 1, 2, 3, and then you have the bottom-up part, which is built with biotic communities, and you nest it where you can, but it's an admitted gap that it's not resolved. How we do that? They don't say exactly how to do that. Basically, you recognize your local ecosystem type the way you want, and then you nest them where they go into this global framework. So it's admittedly unresolved. And most of the problem I showed on the previous page, I believe they come from the inconsistent and incomplete treatment of bioecological categories. So I explained a little bit more about that, but we have to develop a bioecological formalism. Exactly understand what are the characters of the ecosystem, and for each character, what are the states possible. So what are the different states of climatic wetness and so on. And I'm convinced about that because that's exactly how the mind of botanists work. Botanist doesn't see species. When you show me a species, I recognize the species not because I see it as a whole. I see an addition of parts. I see that the plants have opposed leaves or alternate leaves, and white flower, blue flower. And most botanists see species like that, so as a combination of characters. So it's very clear we need to do the same with the ecosystem. If now, so you see, for example, I represent 3 species based on leaf disposition and flower color. If tomorrow you find a species that has opposite leaves and blue flower, you will suspect maybe it's a new species. That's how it works. We are not applying that at all for ecosystems. I think if you look carefully at those slides, you should realize that we are not applying that to ecosystems. We are not trying to dissect ecosystem into characters and apply that consistently and extensively through the definition of ecosystem types. To really try to put that point stronger, look at the effort we put with species. There are books and books and huge amount of books just for us to know what we're talking about. What means pubescent, what means opposite, what means, and we have a whole jargon to name characters of species. Yeah, we don't have that to that level with ecosystems. Now, yeah, I believe a comprehensive and formal understanding of the parts is key to understand the whole. We really have to do that. And if you look at knowledge of, for example, Cyperaceae is a very difficult group of grass, and they were poorly known until a decade or two ago. And they started to be much more better understood because they fixed the terminology. Before that, terminology was varied, it's not constant. So, you know, the inflorescence of Cyperaceae is extremely complex, and different people were using different words for the same thing. And that's precisely what made the taxonomy, the knowledge of Cyperaceae hard to fix, simply because the language was not clear. So I think it's another strong point to say we need really to have a very clear ontology of ecosystem characters. So now, that was the first point. Now let's explore a little bit what are those ecosystem characters. You've seen in the IUCN, I'm not inventing anything. They got the main characters. So the main ones, for example, the temperature from equator to pole. It's very well known. So it's hot at the equator, it gets colder. At some point, you can't even have trees growing, and then only snow. But the temperature, even if you are on the equator, if you have a very big mountain, like Kilimanjaro, these kind of things, you go up and up and up, and the temperature decreases. And it's published, there's many textbooks showing this kind of correspondence between when you go from equator to pole, or from lowland to the permanent ice of the mountain. So there's a correspondence. It's not the same, but it does correspond. So temperature is very important. It can vary using those two things. And now I come back to a word I use a lot, which is, I'm not using so much the word abiotic, but more bioecological. The formalism we're describing is not to describe abiotic characters, but bioecological. It means terms that describe the climatic temperature, but through the eyes of species, not any species in particular, but generally. If we say tropical, it's because it means something from the point of view of species. We did not put the limit between tropical and temperate kind of arbitrarily to dissect the temperature gradient in classes. It's very correspond to a reality. So that's what I mean by bioecological categories. And if you look at where the mountain forest appears on tropical mountains, it shows that it does not matter. You cannot say mountain vegetation starts from 1,200 meters elevation, for example, because it's not the way it works. It changes if you're on a small island, like Seychelles, mountain vegetation starts at 500 meters elevation. So what matters is that the transition we see at 500 meters in Seychelles ecologically correspond to the transition we see at 1,300 meters in mainland Africa. That's what we mean by we are looking at bioecological characters. Now we looked at temperature, and that's a representation of a famous graph from Aldrich. So there's nothing really new about that. You see the correspondence between latitude and altitude, and a combination of both. That's one of the ideas that is exploited in the IUCN typology. It's the functional temperature. So basically, if you are in the mountain belt of the tropics, functionally, it's similar to the lowland of temperate. Okay, so the functional temperature is a more general way if we want to group things. Now, what I try to do is to formalize the ecosystem characters, for example, this one of temperature, and formalize it by representing the combination of the functional, the combination of latitude and altitude into the functional. So you see those words in the first column, they correspond to functional temperature. Torrid and hot, warm, cool, and cold. These are the words that come here. And then, for example, for the category warm, cool, and cold, you have all the variations, all the possible combinations that make it that way. So you have tropical mountain, you have lowlands, temperate, and all the variation of it. Now, the categories that I put there, I tried to keep them as close as possible to the IUCN typology. But if we follow such approach, tropical mountain has to be grouped with temperate, not with tropical lowland, because functionally, that's what it is.
Is this global certification?
Well, this, yes, because in the IUCN typology, they do not try to produce an ontology of ecosystem characters. They do not try to explicitly define characters.
Not based on the functional equality in the IUCN type. Contrary to yours.
Yeah, the idea of functional generalization is key idea, central idea of the IUCN typology, and it's a good idea. But applying that, combining that with a dissection of ecosystem into characters, that bit is missing. And the next idea is to apply generalization to the characters themselves. And that's what this slide shows. No, this is not in the IUCN classification.
Is it in the paper that we produced years ago?
No, it's in a paper I'm trying to make now. It's a new paper we're working on. But obviously, it's a difficult paper, so it takes a lot of time. Okay, so let's do the same exploration now of wetness. Obviously, temperature and wetness are the main gradients. Nobody has ever denied that. It's very clear. So let's look at the wetness. And since I work in West Africa, I'm going to show this example. But all good for me, because actually West Africa is kind of perfect site to see that. Other places are more complicated. So West Africa helps a little bit to understand. It has a long history of study by ecologists. So for many reasons, it's a good example. So if we go back to the main work that explored the temperature and wetness gradient, which is Holdridge, and Holdridge defined those 7 categories of humidity. It's super humid, perhumid, humid, subhumid, semi-arid, arid, perarid. And this does correspond to a reality, a very concrete reality that you can observe if you go in, for example, West Africa. The first 2 correspond to rainforests that are always green. They never lose their leaves. They are semi-resilient or evergreen. We found them only near the coast, like typically in Nigeria. The other ones, this is the evergreen rainforest, were a little bit more inland, but not so fast. Very much in Liberia, a little bit of Guinea. Ivory Coast, most of it is gone, but there were some. And then you have semi-deciduous forests. And those semi-deciduous that are represented here are in this area, in that area, and so on. When you go in drier places, the forest still called a forest, but it becomes shorter, just because of more challenging wetness, kind of wetness. That's why you have typically the baobab, but you can't just look at species because baobab is planted everywhere. So species are not so helpful sometimes. Again, we need to look at the bioecological characters, and they are not absolute scales like the elevation of mountain forest, for example. It's not absolute at a given elevation of 1,300 meters. The same here. You can go from rainforest to dry bush. So this whole climatic gradient over 1,000 kilometers in Africa happens in 50 kilometers on Hawaii. And that's just the fuel effect. This side is exposed to the wind of the rainy season, and the other side is completely dry because all the moisture falls on the first side. So I removed all the mountain because we look only at the lowland gradient, but within 50 kilometers, you have the same climatic gradient. So you cannot define it based on the distance to the ocean. It has to be based on those characters that define a superhumid rainforest, which is abundance of epiphytes, trunk epiphyte, immunophilias in general, stuff like that. You can even see the shift from a rainforest to a grassland at a shorter spatial scale within just 10 meters. If you are next to a rocky outcrop, we have that in Seychelles on the suburbs. In this case, these are iron stone shields where trees cannot grow. Or on the right, the photo is a very drained ridge. So too drained, too dry on top of the ridge. So that's now a different types of wetness. It's the topoedaphic wetness. And what is really interesting is to do exactly what we did with the temperature. The temperature is put aside the latitude and the altitude and looked at the functional results. We can do exactly the same by putting on one side the climatic wetness and on the other side a more local expression of wetness, which is edaphic topography. And if you get that, you have the same graph we had earlier, that is from Aldrich, but this one is new because it's dealing with wetness. So there's a lot of interesting things in this graph. For example, I kept it simple here, but if you go further down here, if I go up, I have a drier topoedaphic conditions. If I go down, what would I have as a moister topoedaphic condition? Well, it's a ravine. Ravines are extremely important. And therefore, if you are in a dry forest zone, climatically, but topographically you are in a ravine, you end up having something that functionally is equivalent to a rainforest. So that's really interesting, and that does correspond to the reality. We observe that in the field, and I'll show examples. This corresponds to the broad concept of rainforest, and this corresponds to the broad concept of dry forest. And again, if we say we're going to really create a formal, comprehensive ontology of ecosystem characters with levels of generalization, then we can maybe propose something like that, where we have the humid sensulato, which does correspond to reality. We talk all the time about rainforest, but rainforest is a bit too simple. If you want to be a bit more precise about the ecosystem we're talking about, you want to know if you are in the superhumid, perhumid, or humid type of rainforest. And they are very different. And same with the dry forest, you can define at least 2 types. And ultimately, at the final level, you can have all combination of climatic and topographic wetness that lead to these classes of functional limits. Okay, so we've been through the most important gradient, which are temperature and wetness. Now, you remember in the UNESCO typology, the physiognomy was at the top. If you looked at the classes in the IUCN typology, physiognomy is used at level 2 and level 3, so it's very important. So it is important to be aware that physiognomy is a very dangerous character to use. You need to know when physiognomy is not talking about an ecosystem type. So in the case of secondary series, where, for example, you cut a forest or you have a treefold gap, the forest will regenerate. It's very well known, the forest regenerates. You have first bushes that comes and close it, and then fast-growing trees, and then progressively the forest comes back again. If you look at the treefold gap where you still have just the progression only started and you have a shrubland, the shrubs, you would say it's a shrubland type of ecosystem, but it's a mistake. Because what we are looking at, the physiognomy at that point is describing the state of an ecosystem type, not an ecosystem type. So sometimes the physiognomy describes an ecosystem type, sometimes it describes an ecosystem state. And it's very important to make the difference. And that's still simple because secondary series are very easy to understand. But then you have to also think of primary series. And that's something that was really at the core of discussions when the World Ecosystem came. And if you, I think, want to know about terrestrial ecosystems and the primary series, reading Clements is really interesting. But let's look at an example. It corresponds with show you. Okay, it corresponds to field work we did recently on this mountain here. This mountain is just at the limit between the humid and subhumid zone. So it's an area where it's dry enough that the forest is sensitive to fire. So you very rarely observe the forest in its final stage. Most of the time it is destroyed by fire. Not to mention there's also the humans have increased this natural phenomenon over the last few centuries. If you go in ravine, you see rainforest. Most of the area must have been covered by a subhumid kind of forest, which we do observe in some sites. And then if you go on dry ridges, you have then on the rock outcrop, you can see the transition that you can imagine from the rainforest of Atlantic, West Africa, all the way to towards the Sahara. But you can see it within the same landscape, within the same site. Now, you have secondary series. So here, if you have a threefold gap, you have the physiognomy that will fluctuate. That's simple. But because we are in the drier part of Africa, you also have a lot more influenced by fires. And then you have those with big progressions due to fire. So the forest burns and burns and burns until it becomes savanna. There's almost no trees. Eventually, if you prevent fires, which has been done in tests, in trials, the forests can come back. But these now are primary progressions. It means they are much more slow. They are very slow. And it makes the landscape that you observe very messy, because all these drawings that you see is what you actually see in the field. Now, to understand the gradients at the back of what you see is very difficult, because you have to be able to put together climate, substrate, topography, but also a history of fires or prevention of effects. But if you do pay attention to those things, then it becomes very simple. If you remove all the fluctuations of physiognomy related to those aspects, then you can easily define a broad vegetation physiognomy class inspired from the classes that we have in the IUCN and that are simple, that cover everything, that are mutually exclusive. And that would be what it is. Okay. Now, there's a few more gradients, ecosystem characters that are important in the IUCN typology. And they relate to another problem. Do we really need transitional elements? Because we've seen there are a number of realms and then transitional elements. To me, it's not really necessary, because if you are going to cut the reality of the climatic wetness into 3 categories, just to dissect the reality into categories, you don't need to have intermediate category. Just because you think the limit between category 1 and 2 does not correspond to anything. Therefore, you add a transitional category. But if you apply that logic, you never stop adding transitional categories. So transitional category and intermediate category does not really help. Plus, if you think of this part here between coastal and intertidal, I think it's very clear. If you look at maps we produce in every country, the coastal strip with the volutier will be terrestrial. It will be mapped as part of the terrestrial land. So it's basically terrestrial. We don't need to say it's transitional. Intertidal, most of the time, it will be mapped as marine. So it's subjective. You could argue intertidal must go into the first class, must be terrestrial. But the need to add a transitional category between coastal and intertidal, you see, it only postpones the problem. We don't need transitional categories. Coastal doesn't need to be seen as a transitional category between marine and terrestrial. As a matter of fact, we map it as terrestrial. That's just a fact. In addition, some transitional realms like MFT, marine, freshwater, terrestrial, is not a transition. It is not at all even a transition. It's an entanglement of gradients. It's the mixture of going from the ocean to the land, combined with the transition from wetland to upland. So if you have a coastal wetland, it will go in the MFT transitional realms. Makes no sense to me. It's not really, we don't need transitional realms. This is more an entanglement of gradients. And anyway, if you follow the principle of dissecting the whole into characters, everything works very simple with those just 2 characters. One describing the transition from marine to terrestrial, and one describing the transition from water to upland. So you can have water intertidal, water, have all the combination. So it's more practical, basically. The same idea that is developed in those approaches that build typologies on a modular way. So to build a more consistent top-down typology, I think we need to combine formalized ecosystem characters and to have those ecosystem characters with resolution levels, from broad to more narrow. So that's what I call a form of bioecological formalism. And then, rather than having the biotic aspect as an addition that you just put when you can't add any more bioecological aspects, why not extend the bioecological formalism into the local scales? Just continue the same logic, but now with gradients that apply at the local scale. The same logic of being exhaustively looking at all ecosystem characters. So basically, to extend the bioecological formalism to the local ecosystem types. Basically, you look at all the characters of ecosystem that are left over. We've already gone through temperature, wetness, but there's a number we have not yet talked about. So those ones can now just go into defining local ecosystems. And that would be a lot to have something like this. Now you could really nest the bottom up, and it really is a bottom up conceptualization of the typology based on bioecological characters. Can really nest it with the top down because we are speaking the same language. We are not anymore doing the addition of bioecological and biotic communities. We are talking bioecological aspects throughout, one top down, one bottom up, and they can nest within each other. So you would have, this is not very different than the categories you have in the IUCN typology, but the wording now is showing that it's the combination of those characters that have been formalized. So we have hot, inland, upland, forest, and oceans. And then we have in hot, inland, upland, shoreline. And so you combine everything. And I tried it. Basically, it doesn't add much ecosystem functional groups because we don't want to have a solution that ends up with big number of ecosystem functional groups at the level 3 of the typology. The IUCN has 110. We don't want to get to 500. It needs to be a small number, otherwise it's unpractical. So following that logic will lead you to about 150, a bit more, but it's still manageable. And then you subdivide in tropical, subtropical lowland. You can now subdivide this refined wetness, but functional wetness, tropical, subtropical lowland, superhumid rainforest. And then you get even more finer, and now you have your local ecosystem. Because a superhumid rainforest can be seen either in the ravine of a percumid zone or in something that is just normal, not a ravine, but in superhumid zone. So it really links the local ecosystem conceptualized bioecologically with the top-down typology. But what to do again with the biotic dimension? Okay, it's an admitted gap. Nobody has a proposition other than just adding those at the end. So how do we deal with the biotic dimension? I say in parallel, it's being proposed just a couple of times. So the main trend is to account for biotic aspects additively, not in parallel. So the problem of biotic characters is that we are very much used to look at biotic communities, and we go out and we say it's a Takamaka forest, or we say it's a Santol forest. That's how we see things at first sight. But biotic communities are an artifact. It's not a reality. The reality is that we have entanglements of ecological groups. If you go in a ravine, you will see moisture-loving species. If you go in a ravine that is next to an inselberg, you might see some dry zone species by contact. But what you have is entanglements of ecological groups. Biotic communities do not really exist. Now, this graph represents the climatic wetness gradient in West Africa. You see, we go from the wet rainforest, superhumid, to the dry forest. And if you have a ravine, what we do observe, we have data and also reports from others that describe that. So that's really what we observe, is that the species that are typical from this zone, you find them in this zone, but you find them only in ravines. So that's observation. On the other hand, if you look at dry ridges or skeletal soils, you see the exact opposite trend. It means the species of the drier zone next transgress into the moister zone, but only in those dry ridges. So if you ignore all what we've talked about so far, and those gradients, you don't see the ridge and you don't see the ravine, you only see those colors. How do you make sense out of it? It's completely messy. We will argue forever if those species stop here or if they go all the way there. Because you've not seen that they go here, but only in ravine. So looking at biotic communities alone is really not helpful, because the reality is that ecological groups transgress. That's what this additional note says. Biotic communities do not exist. In addition, so the same biotic community can exist in different ecosystem types. I'll show you examples. But also one ecosystem type can have more than one biotic state. And I'm not even talking about fluctuations due to rejuvenation or disturbance. No, at the same kind of maturity level, different biotic states. So the biotic communities are really not so important. That's why it's dangerous to just have them added at the bottom up part of the typology. But then how to do it? So what I try to represent here is the top-down typology, following basically the principle of the IUCN typology, but adjusting just a little bit to define each level and the elements at each level by a formal combination of ecosystem characters. You can have the PDF of this slide, so you can go see what those codes mean, but these are the gradients that were in the previous slides. So the coastal, inland gradient, upland, wetland, physiognomy, temperature, those combinations define a functional biome. I'm just following what's used in the IUCN typology. I'm not trying to make it different, but I'm trying to make it by combining formally the characters that they are using, and that they are the good characters in terms of at the level 3, you add the temperature, the more refined temperature. This is the generalized temperature, and this one is more refined. The same is wetness. We use the general wetness, and at the next level, we use a more refined wetness. And here we distinguish only rainforest, and here we distinguish superhumid rainforest. So along the way, it ends up being 4 levels for the top down in place of 3 levels. That is to be able to account for wetness the same way that we account for temperature, because the temperature is spread over 2 levels, general first and then more refined, and it's necessary to do the same with wetness. And then the bottom-up part is not the addition of biotic elements. It's the addition of the bioecological formalism extended from the bottom up using all the leftover characters. And that basically works. You can have ravine forest of the tropical lowland evergreen rainforest zone as a local ecosystem type. I know it's very specific, but at the local scale, that's what we want. And if we want to generalize, well, that's why this is for, because now you can say, I don't need so much details. And we talk only about this tropical, subtropical, lowland, superhumid rainforest generally. So that's the purpose of the typology. I'm still not putting biotic stuff in there. That's because to me, that's where they need to go. They do not come additively, but in parallel, combinatorily. The biotic dimension also can be subdivided between top-down and bottom-up. Okay? But in the literature, we don't find really that. There's only one reference that I found, that is from the beginning of the 20th century, that says something like that. So it's not really something popular. We generally have those two things here, replacing what I propose here.
What do you think about this biotic typology? Think we can actually use, or in certain circumstances we should use this one instead of what we propose?
No, the IUCN typology is the one we're going to be using. That's for sure. It's if you look at what happened since the 70s, which many people try to make a global typology, and new one, and so we need one project, one unified project, and it's not a good thing to challenge the IUCN typology. So to the question, are we going to use this or the IUCN typology? We have to use the IUCN typology, but how to conceptualize ecosystem and nest it into the IUCN typology will be better done, I think, if you have this kind of approach. Even if you don't change anything to the IUCN typology. Sorry?
The biotic typology. Is that something that should be by IUCN?
The IUCN takes this,
It's
exactly as you see it here, and put it here. Actually, it takes those three regions, those three things here, replace the bottom of.
Yes, that if you are going to tell us what do you propose as moving forward, practically.
Well, practically,
I let you continue with the presentation. I don't want you.
oh, it's interesting. So practically, the IUCN typology does the job. I mean, we need just something that helps us store the ecosystem, to put them in big classes. So we don't have to agree 100% everybody on what we have, but it's important we have one system. The taxonomists do not agree, all of them, on the systematics of plants, and yet we try to have one system, just for practical reason. So,
but you think it should be refined. So I
No.
think that is okay, but it should be refined.
the problem is if you disregard this, if you don't try to look at the ecosystem by looking at ecosystem characters, then you look at the IUCN typology, you look at biotic communities, and you try to figure out ecosystem. Most of the time, what happens is you get a weak understanding of ecosystems because you've not been looking at ecosystem characters.
So what we're saying is how can we better interpret the ecosystem to classify it into the existing ecosystem?
Exactly, yes. All this is to better understand ecosystem on the local scale. Not too much looking at the biotic community because this is misleading, but also looking at biotic aspects, bioecological aspects, but not looking at bioecological aspects randomly. Looking at a bioecological framework of characters that are very carefully defined to correspond as much as possible to those used by the IUCN top-down levels, and nesting stuff inside, using at the same time the idea of functional generalization extended to characters. If you do that, I found that I get a better understanding of ecosystems.
Don't use biotic character, but only talk about forest. It's not a biotic character here. Right forward.
When you put forest, the word forest on the left,
Use forest, it's not a characteristic of biotic community.
Well, yes, but not really, because you're not talking about species, biotic community, but it's true, you're using, when you talk about forest, grasslands, and you put it in this side, the forest is made of the organisms.
It's a very hard one.
But you're looking at it as a symptom of aspects of the ecosystems of the. But the biotic.
I think I saw this, I would say, a bird doesn't get too much. It's like if there's a specific adaptation from one particular bird to a particular plant, then get something out of it, etc. But otherwise, it's a matter of physiology. For a bird, for bird communities, you will get not maybe it's a shock to species, and impoverished communities, but if you go inland, but define the position of, I think, birds can be of the other type, but it's so clear with birds, it's a physiology. If you have a grassland, you have certain cottage, a certain group of species. If you have a forest is it's something.
The thing is that what's here the terrestrial realm, that training the marine realm as a lot of the discovery of the marine realm.
If you try to, no, there's not much by Sally, who uses a modular approach, which is what I claim to be in favor, deals with marine. And even in Seychelles, the marine spatial planning is very much a modular approach. But if you want to check if it's what you want for marine, you need to check if the ontology of characters is correct, because you can have errors of ontology, which is a character that is misunderstood.
Yeah,
I can give examples.
Functional system, I think that's very sensitive for the what's you are floating forward. But both system we are taking flat. No, we have not it's not correct, flat. I'm not sure, but both system can appear at the same. It's in low, I don't know, it's low latitude from 2 meters depth, with just a certain amount of light. So potentially it's the same kind of, but the beauty characteristics are how we make the most important characteristics, especially for the communities that should be inside. So this is where
Yeah.
Maybe isn't that biotic substrate that plays the role?
Because for a fish, for example, does it care maybe what is the type of coral? Oh, but it's cooperation.
It's the same as you said in the birds. You will have a coral associated species, and then you have certain species associated to seagrass, because then we can identify if they have more than one chorus and things like that.
Okay, so it's
in the forest, Alabama will be so used to.
yeah. What that might be in nature, animals, dinosaurs, this kind. They need structure.
Yeah,
I mean, the right is a place to protect itself, and that's why we build caves, because before we build houses, we are usually living in caves. So the birds, they also need some kind of structure, to perform their research. So the fish will stay, etc. So that's why many cases we have to see the ecosystem as functional and in terms of physiology. And of course, it's very difficult for some of the I remember. Okay, we have said that people thought that these are good ones, and they had certain view because every species, they only see that, whereas people zoologists will tell you what most of the organisms that even part of the care part, which species it is. If the physiology is the aspect, And we're looking at with the
Yeah, but you see that could be another discussion because it is ecosystem type and ecosystem use. Now, if you think of ecosystem, finding a way to comprehend ecosystem type and to classify them into the typology, and you do that through the eyes of a species in particular or a group of species in particular, then you're more looking into ecosystem use, which is not defining ecosystem type. And when you want to study ecosystem types, you will not end up looking at birds or fishes, or except if you have fishes that are very, into their very specific environment. You look at plants or small invertebrates, animals that are not landscape specialists, but birds are landscape specialists.
Actually, I was exactly able to comment. Just see that woodland is not biotic in the eyes of the non-biologists. It's not different. But for it, let's say that we have to do the ecosystem use right.
Yeah, words of vegetation physiognomy are problematic. If you can get rid of them, all good. But the fact is, it's impossible to get rid of them. You cannot consider those forest woodland as being in the right of my graph here, because at the right of the graph, we're looking at really biotic communities at various scales. Takamaka forest, or the Guinea-Congolian region, or the Paleotropics. These are some kind of assemblages. And so the physiognomy, even though when we say forest, it involves trees, which are species, which is not abiotic, it still goes on the left. Or it should not be used, but it is on the left.
Because the animals live in this habitat that are created by all this combination of species, you will find across the globe in places that are totally different, like the Mediterranean, for example, with the landscape, and go to the Cape and look at the most. It's exactly the same physiology. And you'll find the same, well, exactly the same species. On the continent and so on, so you will have maybe some birds that we don't have in the Mediterranean, but they are also the same. They like to high, and of course they go from the flowers, and like we have this done more with like the warblers, for example, in the Mediterranean. So you will still have that aspect of physiology that will have a lot of influence into your communities of mammal birds and many birds of what.
So to me, physiognomy has to be used as a functional integrator. It has to be put on the left side into the bioecological characters, and it has to be used thinking very carefully about secondary service and primary service. So regime shift, and try not to mix up everything. Otherwise, it becomes a typology of states of ecosystem, not a typology of ecosystem types. And if you do that, then it's fine. And, biotic is, for example, if you have kelp forest. Let's say you have kelp forest. I don't know much about marine ecosystem, but let's say you have kelp forest in this particular kind of environment, but also in a very different type of environment. Actually, you have two different types of ecosystem. If bioecologically they are very different, and you can look at some understanding in the line of what I was showing, they have to be seen as different ecosystems. If you focus on the biotic fact that they are both kelp forests, it's going to be misleading in terms of understanding the ecosystem. Even if they are the same, a priori, if they have different environment, they probably have different dynamics, more or less in the short or long term. So, but the idea of this graph is that we don't have to put the biotic aspect of biotic community as an addition. When we are finished dealing with bioecological character, whatever we got from the biotic or plant community studies, we nest it there wherever we can. I don't think this is great because it's better to deal with the local ecosystem factors. And do not forget about the biotic communities. Of course, they're important, but they need to be looked at in parallel. And I found the symmetry of the graph interesting because if you try to do that, you find that you can have a mixture of top-down and bottom-up if you try to develop a typology of plant communities. What people do for terrestrial when they develop a typology of plant communities, phytosociology, they do it based on floristic similarity, and then when it's completely bottom-up, entirely bottom-up, all the way up. But as soon as you get a bit up, it doesn't make much sense anymore. And that's the problem of the systematics, the systematic of plant communities. It doesn't make much sense when you look at it. That corresponds to some kind of reality. Different scales of evolutionary time or time scale of change. And the ecosystem is the combination of the two. And the fact that when you combine some way the left and the right, you get those things that are concepts we do use. Like paleotropical rainforest, if I do that, or the Guinea-Congolese rainforest, or the West African rainforest, or the West African wet rainforest. It really shows that this is combinatory. We combine those two things, we get back to all the concepts we can come across in the literature. It does work. And the bottom level is not the ecosystem type, it's the states and fluctuations of the ecosystem types.
Yeah, the left is typology, the right is.
The left is my reorganization of the IUCN typology using a formal treatment of ecosystem characters, trying to stay as close as possible to their typology. And the right side is just putting together what you see everywhere in the literature when you talk about biotic plant communities and biogeography, and putting them together into something that is top down and bottom up. Now I have a few examples because at the end of the day, for example, I'm working now on these questions and I'm not proposing to change the IUCN typology. Okay? Just as I said, I genuinely think we should not challenge that. It's now a unified project. Everybody is very enthusiastic about it. So you nest your ecosystem type that you conceptualize locally into the IUCN typology. But to do it, you use this approach, and by doing that approach, you describe your local ecosystems better. I'm going to give a few examples. So this is still the same mountain in West Africa. And we are here at about 1,500 meters elevation. And Kew Gardens made a study there, and they said all what you see on the images are mostly Saxicolous meadows, which we call in this area bowie. They are meadows that grow on ironstone hard pines. And the only places where you have trees is because there was, by chance, right there was a crack for that tree. But to them, all the grasses that you see, they are grasses because of the ironstone just beneath. If you look at the IUCN typology, they have maps. They map this area and they map it as a tropical alpine grassland. Very different. Now they say it's an alpine grassland. To them, it's not because of the ironstone rock. It's because we are so high in elevation and we have grasses sound like alpine. And obviously, they don't have a category. Actually, these are mountain grasslands. But they don't have a category for mountain grasslands or mountain savanna, like I said. And therefore, the only class where they can fit this what grassland do they have in elevation? Well, this is alpine grassland, and therefore they put it there. You see, that approach leads to misconceptualization, misunderstanding of the actual ecosystem. Now, the fact is that this is the iron story. This part here is where trees will not grow. There's this much of soil, 2 or 3 centimeters, and there's only grasses, and the species of grasses are different. But the grasses there, it's a totally different story. You don't have the iron story anywhere near the surface. You have blocks of dismantled iron stone and other blocks of other kinds of rocks. And basically what we have there is a dwarf forest. You notice that the trees are barely 5 meters or something like that. So it's not because there was a problem. This is a dwarf forest. This is a dwarf forest because of the rockiness, the topographic wetness. It's very dry. So these are dwarf forests, but you're going to tell me it's not a forest. There's no closed canopy. Well, then it's a dwarf woodland. But when I say it's a dwarf woodland, now I'm describing the state of the ecosystem. Actually, the ecosystem is a dwarf forest, but because of fires and also humans cutting some trees for wood, it's now not closed canopy anymore, it's a dwarf woodland. And in some places where the impact is stronger, then it's a dwarf sparse woodland, or even a pyrrhic savanna. In some places on the other side of this mountain, you have pyrrhic grasslands, where you have normal trees, but again, not because of the rock, because of the primary retrogression because of the fire. So the two interpretations, both by the IUCN, which they are dealing with the whole planet, so we can understand it, but even Kew Gardens, who were studying this mountain, they misunderstood this ecosystem. And I believe it's because if you don't look at the ecosystem characters, you can only misunderstand it. And as we do that, we propose that those, because in the IUCN typology, tropical grassland, you have pyrrhic grasslands because of fire. You have trophic grassland because of grazing. And then you have hummock savanna, hummock savanna, which they say is only in Australia. Now, when you look at what are those hummock savanna in Australia, they are in dry climates. So they are savanna because of dry. Some of them might be just because of dry substrate, but it's the wetness. So this kind of grassland has to go into that category. So it means it hits a hummock savanna. It would be better, even if you don't traumatize too much the IUCN typology, to just rename it from hummock savanna to climatic and edaphic savannas. Because hummock savannas can be seen as an Australian variant of that. And this grassland that you see here can now fit into the IUCN typology. Otherwise, we don't know really where to put it. So we put it in hummock savanna, and now it's not anymore just in Australia. The same thing with the dwarf forest at the back. You have to fit it in the T31, seasonally dry tropical shrublands. This is also not supposed to be in Africa. And so the reason why it was missed as being something actually very common in Africa is just because of not understanding the seasonally dry tropical shrubland as a combination of ecosystem characters. Those include dwarf forest. I can show you quotes of the documents of the IUCN. It includes dwarf forest on shallow rocky substrates, exactly what we have here. That's another image of the same mountain where you can really see this is something that is a rainforest. There's the look of a rainforest, and even species typical of the rainforest. And they are only in that ravine. All the forest aside, which it's a very rare part of the mountain when it's not destroyed by the fire. So you still have a lot of those dry forest types. But most of the time, fire burns all of it. Fire and humans, all of it is burned. And these dry forests exist only at the edge of the ravines. And then the misconception that comes right away when you try to recognize types of ecosystem, you will say, oh, we have gallery forest. Because now the forest has the shape of a gallery surrounded by savanna. But it's absolutely not the nature of the forest. It's in the shape of a gallery just because of what I just described. The shape of a gallery is not describing the nature of the ecosystem. So that forest there has to be seen as a basic forest of the subhumid climatic zone. And the other one is the ravine forest of the subhumid zone, which functionally corresponds to a rainforest. If you apply that to Seychelles, in Seychelles, the classics is talk about palm forest. But palm forest doesn't mean anything in terms of ecosystem. You have palm forest at the edges of insolvents of glacier, and you have typically palm forest in the ravines. So there are different ecosystems completely, no question. So palm forest doesn't mean anything. It means something only if you're talking about vegetation, not about ecosystem. Now, if you apply all the things that the map we produced in 2014, that's how the ecosystems of Maya would look like in all those products. If you apply it to outer islands, we have even these hammock savannas. We have them in Seychelles. It's supposed to be only in Australia. We have them in Seychelles. These are grasslands, short grasslands, so we have to say meadow, and they are around 3, 4, 6 centimeters of soils on this rock, which is a calcrete. So it's a hard pan, exactly like the hard pan I was looking at in West Africa, but this one is with calcium. Yeah, so it's calcrete. The other one is a ferricrete. On some outer island, like coastal Alabama, you have coastal forest. This is the relict of the coastal forest that was not destroyed. And it's just 4 or 5 meters high. If you think of the coastal forest we have here on Maya, it's very different. If you think of the reason, it's simply the, well, I can't prove it, but hypothesize it's the climate. The climate in that area, and that's described in some paper by Stoddard, is much drier than here. There are papers in the Pacific that describe the coastal vegetation of islands according to the climatic wetness. And this also corresponds to, you have the zone with where Pisonia is able, the zone, and so on and so forth. So in that zone, it's not a coastal forest that would normally have Takamaka, Badami, and those kind of things. It's able to have that kind of interpretation of the ecosystem only if you see the ecosystem characters and you try to find out which climatic wetness zone are we in. See? So that's the last slide. Hopefully that's all the point I was trying to make. So we can only conceptualize local ecosystem type if we have clear an ontology of ecosystem characters. Ontology is kind of a dictionary, all possible ecosystem characters and states of character. Now that such a bioecological formalism must integrate the local and the global scales, even if we are looking only at local ecosystems, because the factors that are active at the global scale, like the climate, are relevant to understand our local ecosystems. Now, it must also integrate regime shift state fluctuations, and all these aspects of secondary and primary series. Now, the hierarchical classifications or typology of those ecosystems must be based on a functional generalization of ecosystem characters. Also, a typology must be based on a combination of top-down and bottom-up constructions. That's quite consensual. I mean, everybody can use that one. But those combinations needs to be done in parallel, combinatorily and not additively. And then there are a few more technical points, which is ecosystem types, when we define them, still need to be defined in a way that can be refuted or discussed by other authors. Therefore, it needs to be related to a nomenclatural type. So that point, you find maybe a couple of references that stress it. So it's not really the majority. Not only the type, you need a type stand for your ecosystem type, but you also need, if you want to circumscribe your ecosystem conceptually, you need to provide a number of other stands that you have identified as belonging to that type. To do that, then you have defined the ecosystem in a way that can be discussed by others. If you don't, it's impossible for others to discuss your ecosystem types. And finally, the name of ecosystem types, because they are conceptualized based on this combination of characters, it has to be at the end of the day like a diagnosis, like those long names you see in the ravine forest of the subhuman. It's like a diagnosis. All the characters put next to each other. Any other name will not work. If we have a name that is biotically oriented, like Takamaka forest, it will not work. We've seen the issues with those names. But those names are acceptable as local names. And that's it. So this work, I've done a lot with Missouri Botanical Garden. Most of the progress I've made in that research is since 2013, in Liberia and West Africa mostly. And we had several projects in Seychelles also in 2014. So yeah, that is the partners.
The question is on the name. Botany, as presented, you can serve for this character, but at the end, we get to this union classification, right? So we do the same here, where
No, you can't have a short name or a binomial nomenclature for ecosystem because it's interesting to know also that taxonomy of species at some point was using diagnoses as names. And we invented the binomial. Now, the binomial is very practical because you can remember. It's just 2 words and you're going to remember that. And it's very important to remember the label that you put on a species. But if we could have a binomial for ecosystem, that would be great, but we can't. Now, plant community specialists, phytosociologists, they did that. They have, for example, for the Takamaka forest, they would say, Calyophylometon. You take the scientific name of the species, the dominant species of the community, and then you make another Latin termination that means the community of that species. So they tried that, but it's not good because if you name your ecosystem with something that does not tell their true nature, you will, even if you understood your ecosystem properly, you will assume.
I think just want to understand. It's not technological. Like yes, we have some binomial classification, but it's coming with a range of more than which is like this. So actually, the region was all this.
For the classification of species.
Because sequential, what you're presenting here, sequential, like the same kind of pattern, like you can remove from one.
Yeah, it's a hierarchical classification. So what the IUCN does, and what I'm trying to use for my own needs, has to be a hierarchical classification where you have level 1, level 2, and all elements of the level 2 needs to fit into the level 1. And the main idea of the IUCN typology, I completely adhere to it, which is the only way to build that typology is by functional generalization. That's why the root being the realms and the functional biomes is good, as opposed to the UNESCO where the root is the physiognomy. That's not good. Because if you have this hierarchical classification based on functional generalization, this is as close as you get to our current systematic of species, which is based on phylogeny. I think that's as close as possible you can get to that, which is getting as close as possible to the actual reality. Now, a hierarchical typology, a hierarchical classification will always be, cannot be anything else but a linear construct. You cannot accommodate things in a hierarchy. Once it's defined, you have to stick with what you have. But the reality is definitely not linear. Reality is complex. It's everything mixing together. So reality will never fit well in any typology. It's completely vain to try to have a typology that works 100%. But as long as you are aware of that, at least having the typology that is constructed by making formal reference to clear characters, to me, it is useful.
I thought for my environment, when you was saying that it was one of them, that does not suffice to bury the.
Well, now the IUCN typology works on includes the marine, but they do not use this modular approach. So they compiled the classes that they found through their discussions with all the stakeholders they were discussing with. And they put together something that works as good as possible, but it's not a modular construct. So for sure, it can be better, I think. If you look at, so you want to compare with the typology by SAIR, United States USGS, because they have an approach which is modular. They define characters, they combine things, they get their classes. But it's also have inconvenience because if you misconceive the characters, the result is not good. For example, for terrestrial, they have a character, they have not many characters. One of them is the landform. And the problem is that what they put in that character landform, it doesn't work with it. Because, for example, to me, the landform is extremely important, but we've seen how much I insist on ravines and ridges. They do not have something where they recognize ravine and ridges. Rather, they recognize mountainous landscape, plains. No, to me, that doesn't work. To me, that's the landform character of landscape ecosystems. But what we are trying is to build a typology of stand-scale ecosystems. So when we talk about landform, we have to talk about the landform that defines the topographic wetness, not anything else. We cannot talk about mountains and plains. We can have ravines in the mountains and ravines in the plain. Maybe it was a bit long.
Nothing, thank you very much for the presentation. We'll need to definitely discuss. I think what you should do is to have this kind of presentation. IUCN works especially group. So for sure there is a special group that is looking into this. Maybe you should I think you should share with them your conclusions and your proposals. And I think the best way would be to see if the special group that looks into this in meeting, probably because all the special groups normally meet during the World Conservation Congress that happens every 4 years, and the next one is going to be that week. And so yeah, because now I see the capability of have a number of and use here. So I think it would be good. To try and long where is all this reflection why they are having to do this, and if they're meeting and they are planning some presentations or even what, if you come to present to me your findings, and then they will be a discussion about which kind of computation is that, practicalities, what you can be, etc. But I think it will be good for you to check that and being looked at.
Why you come back? Especially last week, I mean, West Africa is Australian corruption. It's a collaborator of the lead for the
Well, absolutely. So you need to find out and see if there is something that we could perhaps do next year at the meeting. At that point, exactly next year, I think it's going to be known early. But we then so.
Currently, we have this so we have only more sensitive that we do the and you don't have that. It's very hard to have a direct discussion.
Yeah, but that's why I suggest try and see when they meet and see if you have a possibility for a presentation to everyone that is involved into the whole ecosystem groups. And the same is but it has to do with conservation. It's if it's too scientific, maybe they won't be able to take place there. It will have to go to another congress, about the system, which because IUCN is focused on conservation. But if there is a conservation component, maybe you should try it. Maybe I'm wrong because of this. I mean, I'm wrong because there is not enough conservation oriented, and people would say.
Especially are interested in representing something like that. So my approach will be to try to get feedback from the inform
Yes. So if you want your approach is now, let's need your paper, publish it, and then see how it can be received and how it can improve the system. Correct?
but it's still
I think I was relating a lot of the time when you're talking, because I've been in the forest with people and we've spoken about a bit of that, and when you make distinctions between the ravine and the introvert and the reach, it's not that evident here, but being in the field, you can relate and actually put here. Me, I don't know, with the kids about everybody.
I think the she is to make a bit more of the sense was understanding of only the conflict to see what the sensibility is was like into. Actually, that's the better trying to write the food that food not that is things nowhere is trying to see. That's the orientation of that. I spend 5 years exploring the gaps that I thought were very good.
So, if then I explain my approach, which is a very to and it was because in my approach, I don't explore technology. I did not discuss at all the aspect of functional generalization, which is amazing. So I think that is a gap in that. I think when I put the two together, it was nice. My call was too long to know my identity. And too much time studying the issues of the IUCN and this and that, and the functional generalization characters. And then you already have some techniques.
Like practical, you synthesize and things like that.
Yeah.
Some informations, the last video where you see the two by very important thing for to see representatives and as challenge. I don't have the artistic experience to make it fit. But if you want to make it really, you know your website. Yes. So that's the kind that we see the commission, but it's combination. If I make my approach, politics, we go from one thing to one thing, and totally extend. For the first few days, 10, sorry. So, yeah, so 4 weeks. So I had, for example, I explicitly address of course applications. I think this is where you start to go to that. I think already
It's important for the work for us, we can like coming strong. Kind of before the end stuff. And when you don't have the definition, yeah, you remember with John, when you don't have the definition of what exactly the ecosystem you're looking about, it's very difficult for you to actually.
But what about the understanding where is the system?
There are some service. We have the ecosystem to really want. We have the ecosystem to really want. Okay, it's crazy big
I think that's what John was doing.
It's one of the non-conforming, it's one of the IUCN, but this is done by.
But now it's
I think I was talking about that. It's kind of, they're all using, actually from the, it's related to the CBD. And the.
Times Montreal.
And the gators are. They should do for the situation.
Bon, on est désolé, on vous laisse parce que les enfants d'une personne là, ça pourrait être une tâche. Et c'est au bureau, ici en haut. Parce que faut lui intervenir 5 heures avec le meeting online. Et puis, peut-être des liens un petit peu quand vous avez besoin. Et vous donc, vous partez aussi. Mais bon, techniquement, tu connais le bureau là, c'est déjà plus.
Pas bien.
Tu connais le bureau là.
Quand tu veux.
Michel est tout le chez toi.
Oui, c'est. T'es bien chaud, quoi. Dans la mer, non, pas de l'eau chaud.
Abbiamo